Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall, and today we are going to have a great conversation with Dr. Robert Williscroft. He is a professional debunker, and he has done all sorts of things over his life. He's served in the U.S. Navy and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 23 years. And he has a PhD in engineering from California Coast University and a BS in oceanography and meteorology from University of Washington. He uses his vast experience of all these different things that he's done. He's worked at the South Pole. He's worked in the ocean dives, doing different things, trying to find different artifacts. He's taught people the science behind diving. He's taught at the university. He's worked at Morgan Stanley after he got out of the military and was an investor with real estate and the stock market. And he uses this to debunk things that are going on and how we view the popular views of current events. He wrote a book called The Chicken Little Agenda, Debunking Expert Lies. And he had an article that ran for many years along the eastern part of the United States. It was a very popular column. And the other thing about him, when he was in the military, he's been awarded the Bronze Stars 3 times and the Silver Star, and he's earned many other medals as well. So he's a really decorated military professional who likes to debunk things. So I don't want to take much more time. So let's get into our interview with Dr. Robert Williscroft. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the program.
Well, hello. I'm glad to be here, Sarah.
Okay, so let's dive right into this. You have this concept of the Chicken Little agenda. What is that?
The best way for me to explain that is to give you a little backstory to the book. I had spent a year at the South Pole conducting research, and when I came back, I retired from government service and ended up in a small town in eastern Washington state, about 2,500 people. I was kind of the big fish in the pond there. I was running a small business, and people would come into my office almost daily with the newspaper and say, "Hey, Robert, what in the world is this? This doesn't make sense." And they'd toss something on my desk, and we'd look at it. And more often than not, they were right. Somebody was playing a game, and the information was distorted, inaccurate, or flat out wrong. I would explain it, and it became really clear that I had a column going here. And so I started writing a weekly column that got syndicated around the Pacific Northwest. It was called the Thrawn Rickle. That's ancient Scottish. Thrawn means stubborn, and Rickle means a loose, dilapidated heap. And I sort of saw myself as an educated, opinionated gadfly who addressed various subjects. And typically it was looking at those people who put their hands in the air and said, "Oh my gosh, the sky is falling," as the story Chicken Little goes. And I would explain typically why the sky is not falling and why things are not as bad as they seem, or perhaps not bad at all.
Well, because you can always have some kind of doomsday scenario going on. So why do you think the people or the media always push this doomsday scenario?
You know, I've asked myself that question probably 1,000 times. It goes down to 2 things. In our society, because of how our culture works, and I don't mean just the American culture, but the whole Western, European, British, American, Canadian culture, we tend to follow the money. We go where the money goes. And so money pushes an awful lot of things. But there are people who don't have a great interest in money, or at least they profess that they don't. However, when you look at them, their interest appears to be power and controlling other people and controlling people's lives. And I think those are the 2 things that cause those who put their hands in the air and say the sky is falling to do what they do, because people who are frightened are easy to control. And when you can control people, you control the flow of money, you control the flow of goods. I don't mean to be a conspiratorial person here. I'm not looking at it from that point of view, but just in a general sense, I think that's what's happening.
Well, they know that psychologically when that occurs, they're easier to control. There's been a lot of different papers written on that. So you really like diving into debunking these things. So I imagine you have a passion to really dig in and figure out what the real facts are.
I do. And because of my background and my broad kind of eclectic experience set, many of the sky is falling scenarios appear completely transparent to me, and I can see what they're doing. I can see where they're coming from. And I've had a knack since I first got out of high school for explaining complex things to people. And I just started doing that, and it works well. And I have a lot of fun doing it.
Well, what is your background that really helps you do this?
Okay.
Well, I know you're an eclectic figure, so maybe just give us some of the stuff that you think really helps you be better at it.
As a young boy, I grew up in Europe with my missionary parents. They had been in Poland before the war and had just escaped by the skin of their teeth. I was born in Montana, went back to Europe with them in 1950, and grew up there. So I had a mixed perspective, American, German perspective on the world right from the get-go. I fell in love with the idea of going to space and really, really wanted to be an astronaut. But I had an eye situation that prevented my becoming a test pilot, which you had to be in those days to become an astronaut. And so I turned to the world of submarines. Many of your listeners, you perhaps as well, have seen the movie Hunt for Red October. And if you have, there was a memorable character. His name was Jonesy. He was a black sonar technician, very, very precocious, bright, and kind of stole the show when he was on the screen. And I was kind of like him, except for skin color. Jonesy and I could have been blood brothers. And so I ended up having a great time in submarines, and the Navy picked me for a scholarship and sent me to University of Washington, and I got my degree in meteorology and oceanography, and then I went back into submarines as a commissioned officer. Eventually, I left the submarine service and went into deep sea diving. I spent a year training and ultimately became a qualified saturation diving officer, and that's when adventure really began to happen. I was part of a team. In fact, I led a team of guys who went into the Sea of Okhotsk between the Kamchatka Peninsula and Siberia during the Cold War. We were on a nuclear sub, and we went to the bottom and locked out of the submarine on the bottom at 600 feet and tapped into Soviet underwater communications cables. Oh, wow. And then we also picked up missile parts, spent missile parts from a missile splash zone where I'm sure they thought that the missile pieces were safe at the ocean bottom, but we were down there picking them up and taking them back for CIA analysis. In any case, that was one part of my background. Then I left the Navy and went to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where I ended up for 3 years in the Arctic, helping conduct baseline studies. And I spent a year on the equator looking at the feasibility of mining manganese nodules. And then I spent a full year at the geographic South Pole in charge of National Science Foundation atmospheric research. So that creates a very broad, eclectic background for the things that interest me.
Interesting. So when you were down at the South Pole, did you see any of the fascinating stuff that they're talking about now about Antarctica?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. There is a lot of fascinating stuff going on in Antarctica. The most fascinating, I think, is the fact that Antarctica has the largest ice cover that we've ever measured in the history of our ability to measure things like that. The ice is growing. The ice up in the Arctic that had pulled back for several years as part of something called the Atlantic Oscillation, nothing to do with global warming or human influence at all. It had to do with a cyclical phenomenon that has existed since probably before humans were on the Earth. The last time we experienced it was about 1945, and then it happened again in the last few years, although by now the oscillation is over and the ice pack in the Arctic is as large as it's ever been.
Okay. So, well, you have some things that you've really dug into, which you have debunked, which the Green Revolution, the role of terrorism, government power grabs and intrusion. Can we dive into some of those? And maybe let's start with terrorism. What is your view on that?
To.
Yeah, what is your view on terrorism? What's the deal with this?
Terrorism is a scourge on the entire planet. The idea that you can bring about your political or religious goals by terrorizing people and killing innocent men, women, and children is one of the ugliest things, I think, that we've had in human history. It's not recent. Terrorism has existed since way before the Romans. It's a methodology that a certain mindset seems to think works. I think the only thing that one can do in today's world is to be vigilant, to make certain that we take the steps necessary to protect ourselves from these kinds of people, and do everything in our power to ensure that they do not get their hands on nuclear weapons or dangerous biological or chemical weapons. And this requires cooperation among nations, nations of goodwill, and even nations that may have some problems with one another. Yet the old saw that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for the time being, is something that we have got to keep in mind when we're combating this kind of a scourge.
So what do you think is the debunking of terrorism? What is the thought that you think is all over the place that isn't true?
I think that, and this is not just opinion. There's a lot of fact behind what I'm about to tell you. But special interest groups, and I'm not going to point my finger at any particular one. I think that your listeners will have in their own minds agenda-driven groups that they know about. These groups find that by minimizing the danger that terrorism poses, they can then manipulate the events as they happen, once again, in order to generate fear and control people and control events and build their power base, and in many cases do nothing more than build and line their own wallets with money.
So you think that there's some groups out there, which I've heard some of this stuff, that are minimizing terrorism, that terrorism really doesn't exist and it's just a big fallacy.
Well, you may recall that when the terrorist event took place in Southern California, the administration or people within the administration almost immediately called it workplace violence, even though it was apparent to most of us that this was Muslim extremism in action, and the call of Allah Akbar was loud and clear, and it should have been apparent to anybody with even a half awareness of what's going on that this was an act of terrorism, and it was aimed at part of our infrastructure in Southern California. And yet there were people who tried for several weeks to call it nothing more than workplace violence. Same thing when that Army officer, whose name escapes me at the moment, but when he suddenly seemed to go nuts and started shooting a bunch of people in the Midwest. And again, it was called workplace violence when in fact it wasn't. And my sense is that the reason it was called that is that to call it what it was would have impacted an agenda that exists for pushing down the role that Judeo-Christianity has played in our society and increase the role that Islam plays. And I don't know why people would want to do that, but that seems to be the only justification for that kind of reaction.
Well, what do you think about the fact that they don't want to let in immigrants? And even though they say, because we are in a in a war with Iran and with these, we know we've done a lot of cyber war. I've covered some of the issues on some of the cyber warfare stuff that we've done. And there's been a lot of films out there that show them talking about their goal is to immigrate and infiltrate countries through immigration. Why would we not want to really make sure we look at who's coming into our country and be smart about it? Yet there's this agenda to just let anybody in.
You know, I couldn't have posed the question better than you did. It seems, and what is so astonishing is that the previous administration actually identified 7 countries that seemed to be primarily, 1, either responsible for terrorist acts, or 2, unable to identify people within their borders who were likely terrorists because their government infrastructure had collapsed. And they had identified these 7 nations, and all the current administration did was say, hey, we agree with that, and until we can figure this out, we're not going to let people from those nations into our country until we have a way of determining whether or not they really are not terrorists. And from my point of view, that's perfectly reasonable and logical. And if it inconveniences some people, well, that's just too bad. I would rather inconvenience people than have a bunch of our people be killed.
Well, it's only 4 months, too, that they set out. I don't understand how, it doesn't make sense to me how it got way blown out of proportion and that we wouldn't do something like this. It makes so much sense. So who is behind that? Because it's obvious to me that there's a lot of propaganda trying to get people all riled up that everybody's being discriminating, when it doesn't seem like the actual actions are of discrimination. Now, we need to make sure we don't discriminate against people who are Islamic and people are from other countries. I mean, that's not what we should be about as a country. But the actual actions that they put through does not seem discriminatory to me. And why would they be saying this? All it does is hurt our country.
Let me tell you what I think. And this is opinion, but again, as I said before, this is opinion based upon some close observation. By making this an issue of immigration rather than an issue of vetting potential terrorists, the Democrat Party, that's entirely out of power right now, not only nationally, but in a significant number of states, it allows people who are coming up for election during the coming 1.5 to 2 years to rile up their base. And there are a lot of Hispanics for whom the idea of immigration is important. And I don't quarrel with that. Being able to immigrate to America is a big deal, and it is important. But by distorting the facts and trying to make it seem like the current administration is simply blocking immigration from people of color or people of a specific religion, the base gets all riled up, and I believe that the Democrats hope that this will increase their chances in the forthcoming election, and maybe more Democrats will be elected, and maybe they can win the House or the Senate back. And I think that's where they're coming from. I think it is disingenuous. I think it is un-American. I think the very idea that one would distort the facts in order to push a particular political agenda to the detriment of our nation is a sad thing.
Well, I think we see both sides do that, right? It's a political tactic. It makes me angry when I see that because I think it, like you said, it hurts our country. But why do you think so many people are so easily gullible and just follow along with that? Just pure emotion.
I go into that, yeah. I go into that in to some length in the book, The Chicken Little Agenda, where I talk about our education system. Our education system is very much controlled by the National Education Association. They have, since the 1930s, had an iron grip on what is taught in schools and what isn't taught in schools. In my chapter called Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic Taught to the Tune of, I actually talk about the NEA's Department of Superintendents and their underlying charter. And what is really, really interesting is that several points in their charter are taken almost verbatim out of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. As a young man, I studied the Soviet system and became very familiar with the manifesto. And when I was reading the NEA's charter, the bells started clanging in my brain, and I pulled out my copy of the manifesto, and I was just astonished because I had no idea that there was such a close correlation. Now, where I'm coming to here is that our public schools have completely set aside the main reason for having schools in the first place, which is teaching reading and writing and arithmetic and critical thinking. And instead, our children are being indoctrinated. And one of the things they're being indoctrinated on is relativism, the fact that there are no absolutes, but one idea is as good as another idea. There's not really right and wrong. And part of that is the inability of our young people today to look at a problem and analyze it critically. And so they tend to follow leaders who are willing to rouse them up, rile them up, and lead them by the nose down the primrose path.
So what was the language that you saw in the agenda for the education plan that is, if you have that in front of you, that they're using?
Listen to this. This is a direct quote. The earlier individualism of the competitive laissez-faire system simply does not fit the corporate, closely integrated society of the power economy. Until many of these hangover ideas and ideals are cleared away, we shall continue to be crippled in our attempts to create the necessary new social procedures and accompanying institutions.
That's free market. I mean, why? So, okay, keep going.
The time has come when our social philosophy must be made to correspond to the world in which we now live. This involves, among other things, the frank acceptance of the collective economy.
And that's what's in the education system doctrine.
Yeah, page 122 of the 13th Annual Department of Superintendents report from the NEA.
Wow, interesting. Okay.
What about this? Community services such as health, education, travel, and recreation could be indefinitely expanded to the advantage of all. The state is the only agency which can adequately support and administer these services for the community as a whole.
Well, now, why would that be in the education language in the first place?
Well, my father used to tell me that if you can take a child at an early age and indoctrinate that child to a specific point of view, you will have that child forever. In the 1930s, when the NEA came into its own, the idea of the collective, the idea of communism, that is communal as opposed to individual individually oriented society was a big deal among many of our intellectuals and teachers, especially those who rose to prominence in the National Education Association, were fascinated by the concept. And so they built it into their system with the idea of indoctrinating our children, I think, purposefully in order to move our society in that direction. For instance, what they said in another quote here is, new methods of distributing social income will have to be devised. Neither can the device of free competition in the open market be exclusively trusted to fix the remuneration of the individual.
I just don't even know why that would even belong in the document like that. I mean, a document like that should be, how do we teach our kids to be critical thinkers, understand math, English, science? How do we teach them to be innovators? How do we teach them to work hard? All those things.
Yeah, it's, well, to just give you a last one that's almost the clincher. It is no longer a question of economic planning and control versus free competition in private enterprise under laissez-faire. For better or worse, laissez-faire is dead.
Wow. Now, is this still part of their agenda in their plan?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Interesting. I don't even know why that would even be in there. I don't think it belongs in there. I don't think it should be anything but what you're doing as far as teaching kids.
Well, I spend a lot of time in the chapter on reading, writing, and arithmetic talking about exactly what you said, why we should be focusing on other things and how we might be able to do it. I examine education systems going back to the Romans into modern times, and I examine which systems worked and which ones didn't, and then look at the elements in the systems that worked that seemed to be the things that made it work, that differentiated the working systems from those that didn't work. And then I suggest that we apply that knowledge to our current education system.
Well, a lot of it is
way too much. Yeah, it's too much to go into in a discussion like this, but it's in the book and very well worth the read.
Well, a lot of it is just figuring out how to be good at that stuff. I don't even know why the other stuff is, it makes no sense in an education platform, why any of that even belongs in there. It makes no sense.
Unless your goal, unless your actual goal is not to teach the children of a culture reading, writing, and arithmetic and critical thinking, but instead to indoctrinate them into a perspective that will cause the entire society to change.
Well, at this point, we have changed, but now I don't think it's quite what they thought. Now we have a bunch of people that are not even functional in a lot of ways. I've covered the education system in detail and some of the issues that we're having in our society, and we have some major problems in our communities, and it's like almost Mad Max environment in a lot of places. And so whatever they were trying to do, whatever they were trying to do.
Show.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a television show called Waters' World. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but Jesse Waters goes out to universities and sometimes out on the street to the public, and in a very non-confrontational way poses questions. He'll show a picture of a past president and ask who it is, or he will ask questions related to recent history in the United States, or a question like, whom did we fight in the Civil War, or whom did we fight in World War II? And the answers that he gets are just they're funny just because they're so bizarre.
Stupid, because
we're talking college students and they don't have a clue.
Well, that's like jaywalking. Remember Jay Leno used to always do jaywalking? Yeah. It was just so dumb. You can't believe that that's just our average person. Okay, so you talk about civilized warfare. What does that mean?
Imagine, if you will, what could happen if we took our technology and turned it to destructive purposes, and we did this on purpose. Imagine the kinds of weapons that we could create in today's world compared to what say the Romans had, or our founding fathers had, where they had the long rifles, with no repeating shots. Just imagine the total global chaos that we could create if we found ourselves in a war situation and did not have any constraints on what kinds of weapons we would allow ourselves to use. I think that after the First World War, many of the civilized nations on Earth came to understand that this was a huge potential problem after seeing what the gas warfare damage did in the trench warfare of World War I. And we came together and decided that there were weapons that we simply would not make. This was before nuclear weapons, and then we developed nuclear weapons, and as it turned out, we were the first nation to use them, and I personally think we did the correct thing, but one can certainly argue that. But the bottom line is that when you have the ability, quite literally, to destroy life on Earth, you have to find some way of fighting in a civilized way, and I put the word civilized in quotes. You have to be able to defend yourself when attacked without destroying the planet in the process and without destroying all life in the process. And that's what I discuss in the book when I talk about civilized warfare.
And that's what we're doing now, because otherwise we could wipe people out with nuclear weapons, but that doesn't make sense.
There are times when it might, but it certainly doesn't. When we're dealing with an Iran or when we're dealing with ISIS, except one could probably construct a scenario where a small tactical nuclear weapon might be used to advantage, but typically there are other weapons that will do the job with more precision and give you results that are closer to what you intended in the first place than the wide blast of a nuclear weapon. Let me give you an example out of my own personal background. On submarines, when I was a submariner, and I'm not privy to what they have on board now, but we had two types of tactical weapons. One of them was a nuclear torpedo. It would be sent out, and when it exploded, would create a volume of about 1 cubic mile of destruction. That means if another submarine were inside that cubic mile bubble, it would be destroyed. And of course, in order not to be destroyed yourself, you had to make darn sure that your submarine wasn't inside that cubic mile bubble. We had another torpedo that was a smart torpedo. It was wire guided. It laid a wire in the water so that you could guide it from the submarine. And it had the ability to sniff out and find the enemy submarine. And it could find it, track it, chase it, and it was faster than the submarine, catch up with it and blow it up. And the overall total destruction volume that this guided torpedo had was about 1 cubic mile. So it could conduct the same job as the nuclear tipped torpedo, but it was more precise and better to control, and you could even stop it from doing its thing if that became necessary. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. You need to have the greatest level of precision possible. Warfare. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So that we get the target, but not innocent people.
The concept of innocent people is, of course, interesting.
Okay,
in
continue.
Vietnam,
I do know what you mean. That's why it was funny, but keep going.
In Vietnam, many of our soldiers had this problem. We as Americans, and I would say generally speaking, Europeans as well, when we see children, we just think innocence. We don't see malevolence. And yet, soldiers found themselves being approached by children in Vietnam. As it turned out, they had a bomb attached to them.
Yeah, well, that's sad.
Lots of people died because of it.
But don't you think in that scenario, don't you think they're being used? So that's I know it created a lot of mental problems for the soldiers when they came home, because a child, it's still, they're innocent because they're being used for that purpose. But go ahead.
Well, I don't disagree, but what do you do as we now have where the jihadis are training children as young as 7, 8, and 9 years old, so that as they grow into young manhood or womanhood, the only thing they know is jihad, and the only thing they believe is that their reason for existence is to die for Allah.
It's crazy. That's absolute craziness. And those are the people that we don't want coming in and immigrating.
Yeah, I can remember seeing, it may have been one of the Godfather movies, I'm not sure, but one of the bad guys, in talking about why he justified killing a whole bunch of other bad guys, including their kids, was, I don't want that kid to grow up and come gunning for me.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. It's terrible, but that gets the point of why people do genocide.
It does, in part, and I'm not justifying it. I'm simply saying that in our civilized perspective and the way that we look at the world and the way we want the world to be, and the reason we would fight in the first place to maintain our lifestyle and not be killed by the other guys, is to maintain what we have. And if we utterly destroy if our behavior completely contradicts and destroys the basis for why we're fighting in the first place, then we lose our own humanity, I think. And we have to find a way to do this that allows us to still be the human beings that we believe we are. And that's the essence of what civilized warfare is all about.
So why are we constantly in war then? If, to be truly civilized, we need to figure out how not to have war as much as possible.
Do you know, does the name Bertrand Russell mean anything to you?
I have heard it. I don't know.
Okay. During the last century, Bertrand Russell was a preeminent mathematician, philosopher, and he was maybe the most well-known pacifist. The sign that today we call the peace symbol, sort of the upside down Y in a circle, is something that he created for his organization, and it had nothing to do with peace. It had to do with pacifism. At the beginning of World War II, Bertrand Russell flat out refused to participate in the war or in any preparations for the war or in helping the combatants, in this case, the Allies, out. And he did this out of principle. Was only because of guys like me, warriors who were willing to go out and put our lives on the line for people like him, that he survived until after the war. And I think that we have to understand that we may be, as a people, as a culture, we may be completely focused on peace and completely focused on how to settle problems without violence. But when someone walks up and punches me in the jaw, I have to do something or I'm going to be killed. Okay, and whether it's on an individual basis or a national basis, that's what we're dealing with.
Okay, so that makes sense. But what do you think about the activities or the behaviors that we do that causes us to be constantly in warfare? You know what I mean?
Well,
there's a difference.
Not entirely. What do you think we've done that causes us to be in warfare?
Well, I think we do some stuff as far as controlling certain parts of the world that makes it very, very difficult for them to live and be free people in their own right, use their own resources, and to be able to be self-sufficient. I think we take advantage of resources, and I don't know if we as a country does, but a lot of the money suppliers, if you will, control countries and resources and make it very difficult for those people to flourish.
I know that what you just presented is very much the point of view of the far left, who the political far left, who sees America as the instigator and as the cause for people's misery around the world. I don't have that point of view.
Well, I think
don't disagree.
There are some cases where we have done it and where we do it. And I don't
think this is as a national thing, though. I think this is more company X or corporation Y or individual Z is guilty of that sort of thing. But as a nation, I think in general, we tend not to go in that direction. More often than not, I think we hold out a helping hand and we offer to better the plight of people who are seriously disadvantaged as a nation. I think that's more the direction in which we head.
So do you think we're losing the PR campaign in that way as far as, see, nobody trusts anything the media is saying. Nobody trusts anybody. So what is being said and what we're doing is, have you heard of anything that John Perkins has done where he talks about, and so a lot of what he is saying is that we take advantage of other places for their resources.
I don't believe it. I think that generally speaking, our approach is to pay one way or the other for goods or services received. I think we could do a better job of that, and I have made some proposals, and it might be fun to talk with you about it sometime, about an approach we could take that would make it more likely that we would not be seen by some as the bad guys.
So it's more mindfulness and being more competent in what it is that we're trying to get accomplished versus doing it as an agenda.
PR is part of it, of course.
But I mean,
beyond that,
hold on a second.
This.
No, but hold on a second. So you're saying that instead of it being an active agenda, it's more that at times we're not mindful of what it is that we're doing and that we're not really all that competent at certain things, but that's not our agenda and our intent.
I've been around quite a while. I'm 74. I've met a lot of people. I've met people in high places and talked with them and gotten some sense of who they are. I have yet to meet somebody who is in a controlling position in a corporation or an enterprise or even a government agency who has as his or her agenda the exploitation of people. Although we're accused of that, I haven't seen that. I have sometimes seen that is the result, but it is the unintended result. The intention has been other than exploitation. So and ask yourself this.
So it's more mindfulness. It's more us being mindful and incompetent versus an agenda with intent. But go ahead, keep saying what you're saying.
I don't disagree with that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But ask yourself this: what nation on earth is the end goal for immigration? What nation has more immigrants than all other nations put together? Why do people want to come to the United States? Because of who and what we are.
Well, I still think that we have a different culture when we come here. People feel that there's a lot more that they can get accomplished when they're here. I was talking to somebody that was from Russia just recently, and her daughter was studying, and I was there with my daughter at a coffee shop, and we talked quite a bit while they were doing their thing. Our girls were studying, and she was saying that there's a big difference culturally here. Like we really can achieve and do things. But she did say our education was a lot worse. She said that our education is terrible compared to there, but the culture is so much more open and free, which allows you to do more.
And I could not agree more with both points. The fact that our culture is open and free and that our education system is abysmal.
So it was interesting listening to her. She goes, she loves it here because the culture allows you to be you and you can achieve and you can do so much, but education, she was disappointed. So keep going. You had a point that you were making, and I think I made my point there.
No, I think that I was able to make my point as well. We agreed on your point, and that is that America is the immigration destination. And when you hear people, and again, I'll use the term on the political left, but I'll use that in a very loose sense. When you hear people talk about how awful America is and what a terrible thing we are on the face of the planet, why then is our country the end destination for more immigrants, for more people who want a better way of life than any other nation on earth? In fact, more people come here than all the rest combined. There has to be a reason, and I think it's because of who and what we are.
Well, I also have a problem with us just bashing ourselves to the point where we are hurting ourselves instead of going, okay, how can we be better? How can we care about what we're part of and try to make what we're part of better? Because this is our home and we are incompetent at certain things. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. But at the same standpoint, why are we destroying ourselves? What the heck is that? We should try to make our education system better. Let's identify our flaws and make them better. That's an underlying characteristic of our history, is that that's what we've always done. Well, doing that in itself makes you better on a constant basis. There are issues in our government. I want to get to the government thing, and in our institutions of not creating transparency, where they're hiding the flaws and not, like, there's a law, the HIPAA law in education, and it's affecting their child welfare system, where they can't share problems between each other. And so a lot of the problems are just, you can't address problems, you can't fix problems, and so they're festering, and we got this mess on our hands. If you can't identify flaws and fix it, you're going to have what we have going on. And I think maybe that's a red flag. And maybe that's to say, when we have situations that are festering and going on, we don't have transparency so we can identify flaws. Now, we have problems in our government with not having transparency. Way too many things are top secret. When you have everything top secret, you can't identify flaws and fix things.
I think that, one, I agree with what you're saying, and two, the only types of things within our government that should have high-level classifications are those things related directly to national security, where it's important that we hold things tight to the vest so that the bad guys don't get the information or the plans or whatever. But I think other than that, we should be as transparent as we can be. And
everything can't be qualified as national security. I mean, it has to be legitimate national security.
Exactly.
So that
and it's common sense. It's obvious what is and what isn't. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell the difference.
Yeah, it can't be all the documents that show that we really messed up this operation isn't now suddenly top secret.
And that happens, unfortunately.
I know it happens. Suddenly the Jeep that has all the my dad was telling me a story about how this Jeep had all these documents in it, and suddenly the Jeep goes missing. I mean, it's like that constantly.
You know, we're a nation made of flawed human beings, and one of the things that our founding fathers created for us was a system whereby no single flawed human being can be in a position of power for too long, and this allows us to stumble along and keep on keeping on. And as Ronald Reagan said, become a shining beacon for the whole world.
Well, I suppose every country is filled with flawed human beings, right? And so you have to work as hard as you can to put in place things that allow you to fix issues, the flaws of the flawed human beings, and get those people out of power and put in another person that may or may not be flawed, but it gives us a chance.
Did you hear about the Quaker gentleman and his wife who were strolling down the pathway, and he said to her, "You know, Mabel, sometimes I think everybody in the world is a little bit crazy except me and thee, and sometimes I've got questions about thee."
Exactly. I'm the only one that's not crazy. Well, this is great. What other things do you have that you've debunked that is really interesting? I suppose everything is interesting in your mind because you have a lot of passion for it, but what do you think our listeners would want to hear?
One of the problems that we have in our perception is that radiation is terrible, it's dangerous, and we're scared of it. And in fact, radiation is something that we deal with every single day, all the time. We have radiation from the sun. We've got radiation from coffee cans and from granite and from coal and from fertilizer and from smoke detectors and exit signs and fertilizer and grass. Radiation comes from everywhere. And we have somehow developed a perception that when a nuclear power plant produces radiation, which of course it does, we don't want it because radiation is dangerous. And as a result, we have sidelined probably the single most important energy development the human race ever produced, which is nuclear power, the safest, best, easiest to use, least impact on society, and yet it's sidelined in most of the world because of completely unfounded safety concerns.
Well, in Fukushima, right, they're having a big nuclear meltdown. Is there a level of radiation that can kill us?
Of course there is. Just like there's the fire on the stove, on the gas stove that fries your potatoes, can burn your house down and can singe your skin. Just like the water that comes out of the faucet can drown you. Yeah, certainly it can be dangerous under the right circumstances. Fukushima, was a terrible disaster. It was not because nuclear power is dangerous, but because tsunamis, huge tsunamis, are dangerous. And not only did the nuclear power plant get slammed, but entire cities and regions were seriously damaged as a result too.
Well, I had Elliot Maynard on a show a while ago, this a few weeks ago, and he's a futurist, and he was talking about a device that actually can go in and clean up the radiation problems. And for some reason, we're not utilizing it. There's actually contraptions.
I don't know specifically what you're talking about, but sure, there are lots of them. There are lots of ways of doing that. And what you're talking about in Fukushima is simply the cleanup of materials that became radioactive or whose radioactivity is exposed because of the physical damage that was caused to the plant. And yeah, of course. And it's really a no-brainer. It's just a matter of the will to go in and do it. When you talk about Chernobyl, for example, and I have a whole chapter on when nuclear goes wrong in my book, but Chernobyl was a situation where a purposefully, deliberately caused bypassing of safety systems by a non-nuclear trained engineer was the cause of the problem. And the problem was not even close to being as huge as we seem to believe it is based on the information that has been put out into the public. But let me just give you a couple of numbers that these are accurate numbers that come from the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is the part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development of the United Nations. But a total of 31 persons died as a direct result of the accident at Chernobyl. Just 31. Now that's a tragedy that 31 people died, but it was only 31. 140 individuals suffered varying degrees of radiation sickness and health impairment. That's all, just 140 individuals. Subsequent to the accident, measurements were taken over several years to look at thyroid cancer, because thyroid cancer can be caused by the kind of radioactivity that was produced at Chernobyl. And there were 1,791 cases of thyroid cancer in the following 10 years. But no one had ever done a baseline study to know how many cases of thyroid cancer there might have been had that not happened. So while that's an interesting number, it doesn't tell us an awful lot. The simple fact is that Chernobyl was a terrible thing, should never have happened, and it killed a few people and it injured a few people, but it was not a worldwide disaster. And it was, at this stage...
Sounds like it is. Sounds like it was. Everybody knows what it is.
Yeah. But that isn't what it was. What it really was a problem that developed locally because an idiot was put in charge of something. And I have the details of that because I was briefed by 3 Hanford engineers who went to Chernobyl to help immediately after the accident. And they came back, and one of the first things they did was sit down in my office and brief me. And I can simply tell you that it was a problem, but it is not the kind of problem that should have shut down nuclear reactors everywhere and caused people to fear generating power using nuclear reactors. 3 Mile Island didn't have any radiation leakage. And 3 Mile Island, again, was caused by a human error, but the system worked. It was contained, and 3 Mile Island could have been up and running again 6 months after the accident if we had simply had the will to go clean up the problem inside the containment building and then put it back into operation.
So is it the fear of nuclear weapons that we've seen that is planted in people's mind, and nuclear holocaust, and so now that's what people fear?
I think so. I think that the word nuclear gets translated from reactors to weapon systems, and nobody really understands the difference.
I think energy at the atomic level, because there's some other energies that they're working on, like using the 0-point energy field, which I have an amazing episode that I did on the endless batteries. That should be separated, small, working with molecules, nuclear based things should be separated from nuclear weapons. I mean, it's just, working with nanotechnology is different than nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And you have an organization here in America. You've probably heard of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. You may have heard of the Doomsday Clock. They publish a periodical, and they call themselves atomic scientists. And the clock shows so many minutes to midnight when everything collapses because of the nuclear war. Well, these guys aren't really scientists. Their actual name is the Educational Foundation for Nuclear Science, and they were formed way back in 1949. And their sponsorship includes a bunch of big name people, Nobel laureates, and so on their letterhead. But the sponsors did nothing more than say, "Sure, put my name on your letterhead," without knowing what was going on. But these guys have been pushing this concept that nuclear weapons and a nuclear explosion is the worst thing that can happen. They have created scenarios showing what would happen if you exploded a small nuclear weapon in downtown Manhattan. And I sat down and did an analysis of their numbers, and they're just all wrong. It would be a bad thing, but not even close to what they say it would be. I've written about that and have discussed it publicly over the years. I don't advocate using nuclear weapons, but I think that we should be realistic in our perception of what they can and can't do, and what kind of harm they cause to our environment, and what kind of damage they cause to people and infrastructure.
It's still scary. I think you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I think that's what's in people's minds. And then, those movies with the different doomsday movies, and I think that's what people fear. So it's just not the smaller nuclear weapons wouldn't cause, but I mean, let's think about it. If we had nuclear weapons going off and people were using them all over the place, it could become a Planet of the Apes, don't you think? Well,
what Carl Sagan was mostly responsible for that perception. Carl was he did humanity a great service by opening up science, and especially astrophysics, to the common person with his television show. But Carl Sagan also had an agenda. And basically, what he did was look at a scenario where there is a nuclear war and a large number of nuclear weapons are exploded. Now, when you're doing these kinds of calculations, you have your answer isn't an absolute. You have an answer plus or minus a certain amount, and that gives more certainty to the range of how things could be. And what he did was took all of the variances as far negative as he could, and that resulted in what he called a nuclear winter, where we would end up with a completely clouded planet, shutting off the light from the sun, and ultimately life would cease on the planet. Now, while that is an outcome of the scenario that he created, it is one of the most unlikely outcomes. More reasonably are outcomes that show localized damage, persistent radiation, survival of people and technology, perhaps a fallback to some slightly earlier technological level for a while, but to set it up so that the entire planet is destroyed and all life is gone is basically, it's a lie done by twisting and distorting the truth until it's no longer the truth.
And is that because they want that to be the perception because nuclear weapons really are bad? I mean, because it is very destructive, right? I mean, it can wipe out an area that you're targeting.
So can a fuel-air burst bomb to the same level of destruction.
Now, does a fuel-air burst bomb leave radiation issues afterwards, or has its own deal?
No, it does not. When the destruction is over, there is no residual. But with modern nuclear weapons, there's very little residual either. There is no advantage to have a really dirty bomb. If you're the bad guys and you want to take down a country made of good guys, say you're the Soviets in the Cold War and you want to take down the United States, if you leave the United States as a radioactive wasteland, then you can't occupy it and use it either, and you gain nothing. So there's no purpose for that kind of war. So both nations that, with one exception, nations and cultures that have developed nuclear weapons have moved towards cleaner and cleaner weapons from a residual radioactivity perspective for that reason. The only group that appears pushing in the other direction are radical Islam groups that use terrorism as their major focus, and I have no doubt at all that if they were able to do so, they would explode dirty bombs everywhere in the civilized world that they could, because they have a motive that makes that a requirement.
Yeah, they just want to destroy us. They don't care how it's done.
Their directive from Allah is convert you and me to Islam or kill us. It's one or the other. And if we convert, we're second-class citizens. And if we don't convert, then we're not their problem anymore because they've killed us.
Yeah, it's a scary deal. And they don't even teach their kids anything other than that. I mean, they just study the Quran and that thinking, and they don't teach them mathematics. They don't teach them anything.
Yeah, that's the problem with the madrasas. And interestingly, there are political groups in our country, and I'm going to try to avoid being political here, but there are political groups who would like to see Islamic communities, Muslim communities like those in Milwaukee and in Seattle and in other places in our country be allowed, one, to function under Sharia law, and two, to school their children in madrasas as opposed to our public school system.
Yeah, well, we don't want that because that would be terrible. If you're going to be living, they can have Sharia law on top of our law. But if you're in your country, you have to also do our law. If you want to institute your own stuff, fine. But you're going to have to also follow the laws of the country.
Now, I have to tell you that the two are absolutely incompatible. You can't have both. Sharia law is a complete melding of civil and religious government.
Yeah, but don't you think
our
they can?
Constitution avoids that.
Yeah, but
Sharia law doesn't allow it.
No. Sharia, if they have a community and they want to implement their own rules and things, but fine. But if it goes against, you still have to follow ours. And if it doesn't, then you can't do it.
Well, let's see. Sharia jurisprudence, for example, requires you to stone a female adulteress to death.
Well, that they can't do.
Well, that's Sharia law. You either have it or you don't.
Well, then you can't have it.
There's no such thing. Exactly. There's no such thing as partial Sharia law. It either is or isn't. It's black and white.
Well, if they had a partial, if they could say, okay, we want to do Sharia law for how you operate in your families and how you operate businesses and how you do. I would think a lot of, I don't even know operate businesses because you still have to follow the law in our land. But I think that, how you work with communities and how you do certain things, I think they could put a layer on top, but it would have to be added to. It can't be take away. Like murdering somebody for something you don't like doesn't count because you can't take away one of our laws.
Well, you don't hear me disagreeing with you. I just don't see any way that could be done without completely destroying the basis for our. It's the two are just totally incompatible. Sharia law doesn't allow interest. For example, you can lend money, but you cannot lend money at interest. So the basis of our economic system is borrowing and lending money at interest, and then the investors put up the money, people borrow the money and then use it to create infrastructure or to create businesses or whatever, and they pay it back with interest, which gives the investor a reason to do it in the first place. You can't do that under Sharia law.
But they should be able to create a lending institution if they want and not charge interest and do some kind of thing. I mean, we do have a free country. As long as they follow our rules, they should be able to create some kind of, I don't know how they're going to make money and keep it going. I don't even know how that would work. But if they wanted to, they could lend out money to people and have some kind of institution that does that at interest free and charge. I don't even know how it would work. You charge them a fee instead of interest so that they can stay in business?
That's still a form of usury, according to Sharia law. And
well, then how do they stay in business? How do they pay their own mortgage? They
don't borrow.
They just don't do it because it doesn't work.
You save until you have the amount you need, and then you build your house or you start your business. You go to a rich uncle and you get the money from him, and he expects you to pay the money back and perhaps do him a couple of favors. And of course, there are ways around the absolute rule that there's no usury, and they'll find ways to get around it.
The favors are the cost and the insurance or the interest.
Yeah, and technically that's a violation of Sharia, but when, as you said, in order to get things going, people will find ways, but it's still incompatible with our system. And that's just one small part of what's incompatible with our system. Women are second-class citizens.
I know it. I don't like that.
They can't vote. They're owned by their men, by the father, by the brother, by the husband.
Well, okay. I probably need you back at some point because we're already way past our time, and so that'll be okay because it'll be on full podcast. But we're going to have to dive into some of these other subjects in another time. And very interesting. I think the Islamic thing is scary to say the least, but I do know some Islamic folks that I've really are good friends with. And I think they're very bothered by the way our country is so divided on this. And I think a lot of the people who are really good people end up being the victims of prejudice and racism towards them when it's not all just because you practice a religion doesn't mean you're evil. I think the Sharia law is more of a function of culture, not religion. But in my experience, do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think Sharia is 100% religious. And I can give you, we don't have time now, but I could go back and give you the basis for it, show you how Sharia jurisprudence works and what some of the factors are.
That is a religious doctrine, but people, you don't think you can believe in Islam and not believe in Sharia?
Not really. I think that there are secular Muslims, just like there are secular Jews and secular Christians, who nominally are what they are, but in fact are just people living, trying to be decent and treat people with decency, and ignore the specific point-by-point doctrines of their specific religions. And in that sense, of course, Muslims can be just like you and me.
Well, because there's parts of Christianity that you have to kind of, I mean, if you read it literally, there's some kind of interesting things in Christianity as well. And that
when is the last time you saw Christian terrorists taking out 100 people at a nightclub?
Well, we did have the Crusades back in the day. We don't now.
That was 1,000 years ago.
No, what I'm saying, I know, but what I'm saying is that our religion, the Christian religion, has interesting things written into it as well that we don't practice, like slavery is, things like that. It's just not. We think that the rest of it shows that it's wrong, but I'm just
the main difference is this: Christianity is not a form of government. It is a form of religion.
Yes,
Islam is a form of government and religion completely melded.
And it can't be a religion without government?
Not if it is a religion that follows the Quran. Simply, there's no way. It is totally integrated, and there's no way to pull the government part out.
Yeah, I haven't read the Quran in that detail, so I guess I'm ignorant on that. My understanding is it's a religion like all the other religions, and it can be separate, and at its core, it's a beautiful thing, and all these other the stuff that the people who are crazy, the extremists, are not following the religion. But the core of what it's supposed to be about.
The extremists are following a literal interpretation of Islam. I think that moderate Muslims in today's world take a jaundiced look at those elements of their religion that require the kinds of behavior that you see from the terrorists, and they say, no, that's not what they're going to do, and they kind of sidestep the issue. But the simple fact is that unlike Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and any number of other religions on our planet, Islam is a total, complete meld of government and religion, and beyond that requires absolute adherence to its rules and mandates death for anybody who doesn't follow the rules. It's a pretty drastic way to live.
Yeah, I agree with that. But that isn't what people that I know that follow Islam, their interpretation of it and what they have told me and how they believe in it. So I think that, like you were saying, there's different secular groups. I think there's extremist groups, but there are groups of people who practice a religion who don't believe that. Just
thank
like
goodness,
I think,
huh?
Well, thank goodness, yes. But I also think that now I got to say, there isn't anybody that believes that around the world Christians are not acting that way. But there have been in the past, many, many years ago, Christians doing things that are not savory and kind of nefarious behaviors. So I think any religion can get out of hand if it's not, if they perceive it and their perspectives get extreme. I don't mean to be insulting, but I think that's a specious argument. I think that what a group of people who practice religion did 1,000 years ago has no bearing on today. Today in Islam,
slavery is a part and parcel of the society. Today in Islam, women are second-class citizens. Today in Islam,
but we were second-class citizens. We were second-class citizens not even 100 years ago in this country. Wasn't that long ago?
But that had nothing to do with religion.
That was their argument. That was their argument. You go back there and you talk to people saying culture, they'll go and they'll talk about religion all day long. That's what they were saying as their argument.
Yeah, I don't disagree that they probably base their arguments on religion.
On Christianity, that the woman must follow the man like God, man follows God. It's all written in there.
But that, again, that's in the past. And we have as a culture and as a society, not just here, but in Europe and in other places where the underlying basis is Judeo-Christianity. We have put all of that behind us, and
we've evolved
yes. as a society to the point where we see that for what it was. Islam has been around since approximately 700 AD, and in all this time, it hasn't changed.
Well, but there are people who have evolved, and I think those people need to step up and start taking control of it. And just like in Christianity, the people who evolved fought to evolve the culture and society so that we weren't treating women as second-class citizens. We weren't enslaving others, because slavery was a right in this country as well, and a right all over the world. And we evolved as a society, because if you look at arguments, religion was used a lot as a reason why slavery is okay, and Christianity was used, the religion of, and so we've evolved. So the people of Islam need to step up and say, this is wrong. We need to evolve. And
I don't disagree with the perspective, but there is a major difference, and that is that the tenets of Christianity allow for a complete separation of church and state, so that the religion can be followed, whether it is bizarre or whether it is benign, it can be followed independent of the government that governs the society. In Islam, that's not possible. So it means that, like in some countries in Europe that have a religious government, a Christian government, in every nation that practices Islam, the Quran and the other writings that upon which Islam is built form a part and parcel of the governing documents of the country, and I don't know how you can get around that.
Although in our country, the majority of our laws follow the basic tenets of Christianity, like you cannot. Well, not necessarily, because you can't have affairs with someone else's husband, for example, and that isn't a law in our country. So it is separate in that way. Now, murder and those kinds of things are.
I think that what we did in our secular society, we discovered that the underlying Christian rules were common sense. You don't kill, you don't steal, you don't do these kinds of things. So that's common sense. And we discovered that we can run a society aside from and separate from our religious beliefs. And the tenets of Islam don't allow you to do that. From the get-go, the linkage can't be broken. It's tied into it, part and parcel, and so I don't see any way to separate it.
Yeah, well, we were able to separate things and not make it a law. For example, like you cannot have an affair with someone else's spouse, but we were able to say in our country that even though it's illegal in religion, it's not illegal as a law. You cannot have, you can't have sex before you're married, for example. It used to be a law in this country, but we've separated it and said, no, it's not. But in Christianity, it is. So, I mean, I think
that's because in Christianity, there is nothing in Christianity that requires a close linkage of government and religion. There's nothing in Christianity.
What is the root wording in Islam that says that you must because aren't you not following Christianity if you're not, you know what I mean? So what is the wording in Islam that when there is something that like that?
It isn't that it's a specific wording. It's that the entire religion from the beginning to the end of the Quran, and there are other documents that work closely with the Quran. I don't want to get into it here, but there is simply, they are one and the same. The religious governance and the societal governance are the same people following the one set of rules, which is Islam.
Well, for example, isn't in Islam inheritance is part of the Quran, and how you inherit and all like rules of the government's actually part of those documents.
Yeah, and they're all taken from the incorporated documents that make up the basis for Islam and Sharia law. You can't separate it out. There's no way to separate it out. It's one and the same thing. There's nothing to separate. It is just what it is.
Well,
with Christianity, you had a ruler, you had a king, or you had a duke, or you had someone who was in charge, and he had a religious belief, or he didn't, and someone else had a different religious belief, and you had the priests, and you had the church hierarchy, which had a lot of influence on the king or whatever, but it wasn't the king. The king was something separate. In Islam, it's not that way. The guys who are in charge are the religious leaders.
Yeah, that's true. Although we've evolved as a species, but before the Henry VIII separated the church, his ruler was the Pope in Rome.
No, that's actually what happened is that Henry VIII, at the time, the Catholic Church didn't allow for divorces, and he wanted to get divorced so that he could marry Anne. The only way he was able to do that.
There was still a lot of direction he had to take from the Pope. They were very in communication. He couldn't do something if it was against the rule of the church.
Yeah, but that was not the church governed. That was not the church governing the nation. It was leader of the.
He still had the ultimate authority. He still had to refer to them if something ended up. But yeah, that's different than ruling the day-to-day stuff.
I just think that the difference is so profound and so completely there's not even any comparison. And in our nation in particular, our founding fathers made it an absolute that there would not be any melding of religion and government, and that they would remain separate. And they did this only so that they could protect their individual faiths and their individual perspectives.
Well, that's because they came from Europe where there was a lot of religious persecution.
Well, it wasn't because of persecution. It was just that one religious perspective would impose itself on the nation as a whole, and our founding fathers wanted to be able to go down the path they chose to go down.
I called that persecution because there was a lot of, like, certain people, if you didn't believe a certain religion, there's a lot of harm back then. So our founding fathers purposely separated church and state because in Europe they didn't like that because it was melded together in a lot of ways.
It still is.
Yeah.
In Europe.
Exactly. But okay, well, this is I hope you enjoyed that conversation because it can get
absolutely.
It can get kind of as you struggle through the learning. Okay, well, thank you so much, and I am going to have you back because it is kind of it's a testy subject, but I hope you're okay with that.
I am completely okay with it, and we haven't even touched on my science fiction novels.
Oh, I'd love to talk about. Now, how can people learn more about you?
Go to my website, robertwilliscroft.com.
And they can get you have science fiction novels, you have novels on debunking theories and things. And what else do you have there? What are your science fiction? Go ahead.
Well, I have one book called Operation Ivy Bells that discusses what I told you a little bit about when we locked out onto the ocean bottom. This is a novel that tells that entire story from a first-person perspective. I have a science fiction novel called Slingshot, which tells the story of the construction of the world's first space launch loop, which is a technology that is viable today where we don't need rockets to get into space. It's an award-winning book.
Oh, that's incredible. You got to talk about that next time. I got to get you on to talk about that.
I also wrote a book called The Star Child Compact, which makes an interesting assumption, without going into any of the details, that Saturn's moon Iapetus is a derelict starship. And having made that assumption, Earth sends an expedition to Iapetus, and the first half of the book is about the building of the spaceship and the getting to Iapetus, and the second half is what they find and how that impacts life on Earth and the humanity in general.
Now, is any of your books based on true facts?
Well, Iapetus is, in fact, has a wall of mountains around the equator, about 20 kilometers high and 20 kilometers wide. It makes it look a little bit like a walnut. And the density of Iapetus is such that if it were a snowball, it would be about right, except it's a rocky moon, which doesn't make sense unless it's hollow. And so I'm looking at physical characteristics of a moon of Saturn and extrapolating a might be, and then from that I'm extrapolating a story. Now, Slingshot with the Space Launch Loop, that's based upon viable technology that we can do today, and when it becomes cost effective, I'm certain we will do it. So it's just a high-tech story that talks about the men and the women who build this structure and the struggles they have and the challenges they have.
They need to make a movie out of that one.
Oh, it would be a good movie, I think.
So now, what do you think about people's arguments? I have to ask you this before I go. What do you think about people's arguments with the moon being hollow?
Well, in a word, BS.
That's one of your debunking. No, and why is it? If you give just a couple facts on why that's BS.
We are able to measure with enormous precision what the mass of the moon is, and when we do that and compare the mass of the moon to the size of the moon and what we are able to deduce that the moon is made of, the kinds of rock that make up the moon, there is no possibility that it could be hollow because it wouldn't have sufficient density. So all of the numbers come together to give you a rocky moon that is rocky down to its core, that does not have a liquid core because it has no magnetic field. And it's just that the science and the engineering makes that particular possibility impossible.
Okay, well, that's good. That's what I wanted to hear. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to have your information up on my radio page so they know how to get hold of you. Otherwise, you also told them here. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.